When empires can no longer pay their debts. How it begins. There is one detail that is almost always overlooked when people talk about government debt. We tend to imagine default as a sudden catastrophe, a sharp snap, followed immediately by chaos. But real history usually unfolds differently. What disappears first is not money, it is trust, and almost never in a single day. Even the concept of sovereign default is surprisingly hard to pin down. Economists and legal scholars do not agree on a single definition. In the simplest sense, it means breaking a promise on public debt, missing a payment, suspending transfers, or changing contract terms to the disadvantage of creditors. But governments rarely use the word default. Instead, they speak of temporary payment suspensions, revisions of terms, conversions, or restructuring. In practice, these phrases describe the same reality. Obligations are altered because continuing under the original rules has become either financially impossible or politically unacceptable. The more interesting question is how powerful states arrive at this point. How do large empires, with armies, territory, tax systems, and resources, find themselves unable to honor their debts? Early modern history offers a remarkably clear case, one that scholars have reconstructed almost line by line. Spain under Philip II in the 16th century. Why Philip II of Spain matters. This was not a poor debtor. Spain was the central power of Europe. It controlled vast territories, maintained a formidable military, governed overseas colonies, and received silver from the New World. And yet, under Philip II, the crown repeatedly suspended payments on short-term loans, episodes that modern terminology classifies as sovereign defaults, or bankruptcies depending on interpretation. Historians usually point to crises in 1557 to 1560, 1575 to 1577, and 1596 to 1597, with 1560 often treated as part of the early cycle. To understand why this happened, it helps to look at the underlying mechanism because it is deeply human and strangely logical. The empire was constantly at war, often on several fronts at once. Military expenditures rose faster than stable revenues. The state filled the gap with borrowing. This is where financial engineering entered the picture. Spain relied on two main instruments, well documented in academic research. Asientos, short-term loans from private bankers, frequently Genoese. These were flexible but expensive and highly sensitive to confidence. Juros, longer-term obligations serviced largely through tax revenues, closer to what we would now call revenue-backed bonds. As long as creditors believed the crown would eventually recover, Spain could borrow again and again, rolling over old obligations with new ones. This was not necessarily deception. It could be a rational expectation that future taxes would arrive, silver shipments would land, wars would end, treaties would be signed, or political arrangements would allow higher collections. But every such system has limits. How inability to pay begins research on Philip II of Spain highlights a critical point. Formally, crises began when the crown declared a suspension of payments on asientos, its short-term contracts. On the surface, this looks like an abrupt decision. In reality, it reflected a deeper accumulation of strain. Debt service had reached the ceiling of available revenues. Much of the crown's income had already been pre-committed to long-term obligations and basic operations. At that moment, governments typically discover that a large share of regular revenue is already pledged. Raising new taxes is politically and administratively difficult. War cannot be postponed. Creditors begin demanding harsher terms or simply stop lending. During the crisis of 1575 to 1577, historians also emphasize the conflict between the crown and domestic political institutions, particularly the Cortes. At the same time, credit markets froze as bankers refused to extend funds under existing conditions. It is important not to moralize this process. This is not a story of evil bankers or a bad king. It is a system in which all participants operate under risk and constraint. Even leading historians and economists continue to debate whether Spain's position was fundamentally unsustainable from the start, or whether the debt appeared manageable during certain periods, until successive military and political shocks pushed it over the edge. Why this example matters? Because it breaks two common illusions. Illusion 1, empires do not default. History suggests the opposite. Even powerful states suspend payments and alter terms. Across centuries, sovereign defaults appear regularly. One reason economists build large historical databases to identify recurring patterns rather than treating each crisis as a unique anomaly. Illusion 2, default is the end. Spain's experience shows something different. After suspensions, negotiations followed. Terms were restructured. Financial life continued. Creditors did not disappear forever. The state still had resources and a tax base, and lenders still had an incentive to recover part of their claims and continue business under new conditions. This does not make default painless, but it shows that it is often not a final explosion, rather a painful reconfiguration. In the next part, we step back and examine why imperial debts almost always grow quietly, how wars, temporary taxes, and financial innovations create the impression that everything remains under control, right up until the moment it breaks. How imperial debt grows quietly. When historians and economists study imperial debt crises, they almost always reach the same conclusion. Debt rarely feels like a problem at the moment it is accumulating. On the contrary, in its historical context, it usually appears rational, sometimes even unavoidable. This is especially clear in studies of the early modern period, where enough records survive to reconstruct the thinking of rulers, treasurers, and creditors. 16th century Spain, 18th century France, and Britain during the Napoleonic Wars all display the same pattern. Debt does not rise because of one fatal mistake. It rises through a sequence of decisions, each of which seems reasonable on its own. Debt is a tool of governance. Today, public debt is often viewed as a sign of weakness, but historical research suggests something different. For early empires, debt was primarily a way of managing time, a method of shifting part of today's expenses into the future. When tax systems were limited and collections required political compromise, borrowing allowed governments to fund immediate needs without triggering social unrest. This does not mean rulers were unaware of the risks. Rather, they judged those risks to be preferable to the alternatives. Research by Drelichman and Voth on Philip II's Spain shows that the crown deliberately balanced short-term and long-term obligations. It was not simply living beyond its means, it was actively managing its financial constraints. War and the debt spiral. Nearly every major surge in government debt throughout history coincides with war. This is confirmed both by qualitative historical accounts and by large quantitative databases of sovereign defaults. The reason is not military incompetence. It lies in the structure of wartime spending. War demands immediate resources, armies, fleets, logistics, alliances. Taxes, by contrast, are collected slowly and often face political resistance. Under these conditions, debt becomes the only way to bridge the gap between expenditures and revenues. In 16th century Spain, much of the borrowing was directly tied to military campaigns in the Netherlands and the Mediterranean. Silver from the Americas created an impression of stable income, yet research shows that most future revenues had already been pledged to debt service. Temporary measures that become permanent. Another recurring feature is the temporary nature of taxes and borrowing, which gradually stops being temporary. Fiscal historians note that new taxes were almost always introduced as emergency measures linked to war or crisis, but emergencies rarely ended quickly. Over time, governments found themselves trapped. Removing taxes became politically impossible, while raising them further was risky. Deficits were once again filled through borrowing. This mechanism is well documented in 18th century France, where a large share of revenue had already been earmarked for debt payments, leaving the state with shrinking room to maneuver. Financial innovation and the complexity trap rising debt is almost always accompanied by financial innovation. New instruments create a sense of control. Obligations are spread across maturities, creditor groups, and revenue sources. In Spain, this took the form of asientos and juros. In Britain, centralized debt management and consolidated bonds. In France, intricate rent-based systems. Each structure solves specific problems, but also increased the complexity of the financial architecture. Economic historians emphasize that complexity often hides growing risk. When liabilities are dispersed across many instruments, the system's overall vulnerability becomes harder to see, even as individual components begin to fail. Why early warning signs are ignored. One of the most consistent findings in sovereign debt research is that early warning signals rarely appear catastrophic. They may show up as rising borrowing costs, fewer willing lenders, or more difficult negotiations. But each signal can be explained away as temporary: a war, political instability, or fluctuating revenues. At the same time, political elites tend to operate on short-time horizons. The priority is keeping the state functioning today, not ensuring theoretical sustainability decades into the future. Historical evidence suggests that empires do not stumble blindly into debt crises. They walk toward them step by step, making choices that seem justified at the moment they are made. This is why crises rarely appear inevitable in advance. They become obvious only when the system loses flexibility, and that is where we turn next, to the breaking point, the moment trust collapses and debt stops being a manageable tool and becomes a problem. The breaking point, when trust disappears. Historical research on sovereign debt shows that financial crises almost never begin when debt reaches a specific numerical level. Much more often, the breaking point arrives when creditors stop believing that a government can manage its obligations without being forced to worsen the terms. This distinction is crucial. Comparative crisis databases reveal that similar debt levels have produced very different outcomes across countries and eras. Debt alone does not explain the timing of a crisis. Trust, and the institutional environment surrounding it, matters just as much. What trust means in sovereign debt. In academic literature, creditor trust is not a moral concept. It refers to an expectation that obligations will be honored according to their original agreements. As long as this expectation holds, governments can roll payments forward, refinance existing debt, and negotiate new terms without suspending transfers. Financial historians emphasize that trust rests on a state's ability to control revenues, reallocate resources, and maintain predictable rules for creditors. When these mechanisms begin to weaken, confidence erodes, even if the country remains technically solvent. Why the breaking point comes before. Official default studies of historical crises show that formal declarations of default usually represent a late stage of the process. The real turning point comes earlier, with changes in creditor behavior and financing conditions. At this stage, governments may still meet current payments, but they lose the ability to attract new funds freely. It is this loss of flexibility that separates a sustainable debt position from a crisis. 16th century Spain and the credit crisis of 1575 to 1577. A classic example of collapsing trust is Spain's financial crisis of 1575 to 1577. Although the Crown formally announced a suspension of payments on short-term obligations, research suggests that the decisive event was creditors' refusal to continue lending under existing terms. Genoese bankers, who supplied short-term credit through the asientos system, faced a situation in which much of the Crown's future revenue had already been pledged. Political constraints and conflicts with the Cortes further weakened confidence in the Crown's ability to redirect tax flows. As a result, the short-term credit market effectively froze, even though resources still existed. This episode shows that crises can begin not because money runs out, but because coordination and trust collapse. Why trust disappears. So suddenly economic history highlights a paradox of trust. It builds slowly, but can vanish abruptly. As long as most creditors believe a situation remains manageable, negative signals can be ignored or treated as temporary. But once doubts emerge, the rational response is to reduce exposure and stop lending. This behavior becomes self-reinforcing. Each creditor's withdrawal increases anxiety among the others. The loss of maneuvering space research by the IMF suggests that the decisive moment arrives when governments lose room to maneuver between taxes, debt, and spending. When revenues are already allocated, new taxes are politically constrained, and markets demand harsher conditions, even a small shock can trigger a crisis. It is important to emphasize that this is not about a lack of resources. It is about a lack of confidence in how those resources are managed. That is why crises often appear sudden, even though their foundations were laid over many years. Historical evidence supports a consistent conclusion. In imperial debt histories, the breaking point is driven primarily by the loss of trust, not by reaching a fixed debt threshold. Before that moment, debt can grow and be serviced. After trust disappears, even maintaining existing arrangements becomes impossible. How the breaking point affects everyday life. When government debt enters a crisis phase, change rarely begins with dramatic announcements. For most people, the turning point is not experienced as a default or a financial crisis. Instead, it arrives as a slow shift in daily reality. Historical sources show a consistent pattern. Prices change first. Goods become harder to find. Rules quietly evolve. Only later do official statements catch up. Economic history highlights an important point. Government financial decisions almost always reach the public indirectly, through markets, taxes, and administrative measures. People do not read debt reports. They feel the consequences long before the crisis receives a name. Rising prices and falling purchasing power. One of the most common effects of a financial turning point is rising prices. This can happen for many reasons. Shortages caused by disrupted trade, higher taxes, declining confidence in money, or changes in currency policy. Historians note that even without formal inflationary measures, prices can rise simply because stability has been lost. For ordinary people, this means declining purchasing power. Wages, rents, and fixed payments almost always lag behind rising costs. Early modern European records repeatedly contain complaints that familiar goods become unaffordable and everyday expenses unpredictable. It is important to note that this process rarely looks like a sudden collapse. More often, it unfolds through a series of small changes, each one manageable on its own, but together reshaping daily life. Taxes and hidden fiscal pressure. When governments lose access to cheap credit, they are forced to extract resources from within the economy. Historical research shows that in such situations, the tax burden almost always increases, even when official rates remain unchanged. This often happens through expanding the tax base, stricter collection, removing exemptions, intensified enforcement. For the population, it feels like pressure coming from every direction. Merchants complain about tariffs, artisans about levies, landowners about revised obligations. At the same time, governments rarely raise taxes in a clear and transparent way. Instead, fiscal pressure becomes fragmented and uneven. Historians emphasize that this kind of unpredictable taxation is especially damaging to everyday economic life. Labor markets and job insecurity. Financial stress also affects employment. As public finances tighten, military and administrative spending is reduced, payments are delayed, and orders are cut. This directly impacts jobs, especially in cities where many livelihoods depend on government contracts or trade. Historical sources show that during financial crises, hidden unemployment rises, temporary and unstable work becomes more common. Migration increases as people search for income. For ordinary citizens, this translates into uncertainty about the future. Even if the economy continues to function on paper, money becomes an object of distrust. One of the deepest, yet least visible consequences of crisis is a change in how people relate to money itself. When states face financial strain, confidence in currency, debt claims, and payment promises begins to weaken. Historians observe that in such periods, people tend to move savings into physical assets, avoid long-term commitments, rely on alternative means of exchange. This is not necessarily panic. More often, it is a rational response to uncertainty. But at the level of the broader economy, this behavior slows circulation, weakens trade, and fragments markets. Social tension without open revolt. It is important to emphasize that financial turning points do not always lead to immediate uprisings or revolutions. Historical evidence suggests that more often they produce quiet social tension, growing dissatisfaction, declining trust in institutions, and a sense of unfairness. People may continue to follow formal rules, but they increasingly evade taxes, avoid official channels, rely on local networks of mutual support. These shifts are difficult to measure statistically, yet they shape the long-term social consequences of crisis. Why these changes are often underestimated. One reason the impact of financial crises on everyday life remained overlooked for so long is that historical records usually document government decisions, not personal experience. Modern research increasingly turns to letters, court cases, municipal archives, and private accounts. These sources reveal that for most people, a crisis is not a date or an announcement. It is a gradual process of adapting to worsening conditions. A government's financial breaking point almost never remains abstract. It slowly enters daily life through prices, taxes, work, and attitudes toward money. Each change may seem modest on its own. Together, they create a sense of instability that can persist for years. In the final part, we will look at what happens after the breaking point, how states emerge from crisis, which strategies prove sustainable, and why default or restructuring does not necessarily mean the end of the system. What happens after the breaking point? How systems survive historical experience shows that a financial breaking point, even a default or payment suspension, rarely marks the end of a state or an economic system. On the contrary, in many cases, new and more stable rules emerge precisely after crisis. This does not make crises painless, but it shows that they are often transitional phases rather than final collapses. Economic historians emphasize that states rarely disappear because of debt. They change how they manage it. Negotiation and restructuring as the typical outcome. One of the most common paths after a breaking point is negotiation with creditors. The history of sovereign debt shows that restructuring, not complete repudiation, is the usual result of crisis. In earlier periods, this might take the form of converting short-term debt into long-term obligations, lowering interest rates, delaying payments, reallocating tax revenues. In later eras, mechanisms became more formalized, but the logic remained the same. Creditors generally prefer to recover less while preserving relationships rather than lose everything. This is why access to financing often returns over time, even after severe crises. Historical default databases confirm that most countries eventually re-enter capital markets, sometimes sooner than expected. Institutional change after crisis. A second key element of life after the breaking point is institutional reform. Crises tend to expose weaknesses in how revenues, spending, and debt are managed, flaws that were previously masked by growth or external inflows. Historians note that after crises, fiscal administrations become stronger, tax systems are simplified, debt management becomes more centralized, more durable financial institutions emerge. A classic example is Britain in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Following financial shocks and wars, it developed a highly credible system of public debt, largely through institutional reform. This experience is often contrasted with the more fragmented systems of continental Europe. Why trust can return. One of the most counterintuitive findings of economic history is that trust can recover even after default. This may seem illogical, but it is supported by many empirical cases. The reason is that creditors evaluate not past behavior alone, but new rules. If after crisis, obligations become more transparent, revenues more predictable, institutions more reliable, then risk may appear lower than before. Default does not necessarily destroy reputation forever. Sometimes it marks the beginning of a more stable phase. The cost of recovery. It is important to stress that recovery almost always comes at a price. Economic research shows that growth slows, investment declines, social tension persists, rebuilding can take years. For ordinary people, this means improvement arrives slowly. Even when macroeconomic indicators stabilize, trust within society takes longer to heal. That is why historians caution against viewing crises as cleansing or beneficial. They may lead to reform, but through real losses. Why crises keep repeating? The final and perhaps most important question is why such crises continue to recur, despite accumulated historical knowledge. researchers point to several persistent forces: short political decision horizons, pressure from extraordinary events such as wars or external shocks, the temptation to use debt as a temporary solution, the illusion that this time is different. History shows that awareness of past crises does not always prevent future ones, but it does help us understand their structure and consequences. Imperial debt history is not the story of a single collapse. It is a story of adaptation. Debt accumulates gradually. The breaking point arrives through the loss of trust. Recovery almost always involves changes to rules and institutions. That is why financial crises appear repetitive, yet never identical. They unfold under different conditions and with different outcomes, but according to a similar logic. Understanding that logic does not provide simple answers, but it allows us to see debt crises not as anomalies, but as part of the long historical rhythm of states and economies.